series for 2015. We're very, very fortunate to have Professor Robert Alter from the University of California at Berkeley. It's one of those other campuses of the University of Berkeley. Some of you may have heard of it. If Bob Alter had only worked on translation and commentary on the Hebrew Bible, I think he would have an academic record that would be envied by almost any academic in the United States. But in truth, that's only a part of what he has done in the field of comparative literature. He's also written a great deal of very important and very good work on comparative literature, more modern literature, and he has such a list of honors and distinctions that I'm not going to go through them, but I will mention one that just happened to be of personal interest to me. In the mid-90s, he was one of the people who founded an organization then known as the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics, which was mainly academic, but by no means exclusively academic organization devoted to kind of a traditional study of literature with the starting point that literature has some value in its own right, which was a view at that time especially was not necessarily entirely in fashion in literature departments in the United States. And I think that organization, which Bob helped to found and was president of for a while, did a lot of good for those of you, or those of us who value literary studies. But that, again, is just one aspect of a many, many faceted career. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Professor Robert Alter, whose lecture is entitled "The Challenge of Translating the Bible."
Thank you very much, Professor Lewis. Now, I see that there is a mic in the distance on the ceiling. I have no idea whether it's operative. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, so we're all right. Now, I guess I should start on a personal note, and I'm going to go back a little later to what I've been doing with translating the Bible. A number of people over the years have asked me very sensibly, why would you do such a bizarre thing as to do a new translation of the most translated book in the English language? And my answer is always the same, that there's something wrong with all the existing things. Now, I don't want to sound arrogant about this. To begin with, I'm sure there are things that are wrong with my translation. No translation is perfect. No translation can fully represent the subtlety and power of the original. But I think there are many things in the existing translations where simply issues of the Hebrew style are not addressed. And so let me spell that out briefly, and then I will go on in the second part of my presentation to a few extended illustrations of what I tried to do to meet these issues. First, I guess I have to say categorically that I think the spate of new English translations of the Bible that were produced basically in the second half of the 20th century are, on the whole, disasters. I think that they're disasters for a couple of reasons. One is, if you do a doctorate in biblical studies at, let's say, Yale or the University of Pennsylvania or Harvard, you will spend a lot of time doing things which are important for understanding the Bible, like learning Akkadian, learning the methodology of text critical study. I don't denigrate any of this, but the category of style, and I say this as a literary person, the category of style does not exist. I think behind what goes on in the classroom, there's also a split in, let's say, cultural exposure. That is, if you go back to the King James Version, I'll say a few things very briefly about that in a few minutes. You can see that there is a seamless connection between the literary culture of the age and that committee of whatever it was, nearly 50 scholars who were churchmen and eminently learned men who produced the King James Version. So that, for example, Lancelot Andrewes, who was really the moving figure in the various subcommittees which were called, for some reason, corporations in the early 17th century. Lancelot Andrewes was one of the great prose stylists in England in the early 20th century. And you certainly could not say that about the New English Bible or the Jerusalem Bible or the Jewish Publication Society Bible. In fact, I had, when my translation of Genesis came out, I had an interesting exchange of letters with an old friend of mine who's a fine biblical scholar who died about 3 years ago, Moshe Greenberg, who began his career at the University of Pennsylvania and then spent most of it at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Moshe had been on the Jewish Publication Society Committee, which had an entirely different conception of translation. So I sent him my Genesis, and he clearly did not like it. But he wanted to be tactful. He said, you know, it's admirable what you're trying to do, but I don't think it works very well. And one of the things that he criticized was that in my translation, the and structure of Hebrew prose sentences is replicated. So there are many, many sentences that begin with and Moshe wrote me, he said, you know, biblical Hebrew can work that way. You have this particle v at the beginning of a sentence, and you can repeat it, but you cannot do this in English. So I wrote back, I did not get a response, but I said, look, I've spent a lot of my career studying English style, and parataxis, this structure of parallel syntax, and, is one of the important available options in English style. And as far as I'm concerned, the greatest piece of extended prose poetry in the English language in the last 100 years is Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end of James Joyce's Ulysses. And is probably the most important word in that. That's the structure she uses, just as the Bible does. So I mention this because Moshe Greenberg, who was a superbly intelligent man and a fine scholar, I'm sure did not spend a single moment reading James Joyce. So we have this split. Okay, so what is it that I think needs to be addressed that generally isn't addressed? First is a matter of diction. That is, there are, as far as I can see, 3 levels of diction perceptible in the Bible. There's the narrative prose, which uses what I would call middle diction. It's almost homespun. It doesn't use fancy words. The vocabulary is deliberately, I think conventionally, restricted. So you have all kinds of words that appear in poetry that will never appear in the prose. There's only one Hebrew word for light, L-I-G-H-T, that appears in the narrative, whereas in the poetry, you have words like ziv, zohar, gohot, that words that would correspond to splendor, effulgence, brilliance, and so forth. So you have that middle diction of the prose. Then you have the dialogues, which are pretty much composed in proper literary Hebrew, but they're maybe not constantly, but very often, little gestures in the direction of the colloquial. And I think those need to be honored. And later on, I will try to give you an example of that. And then there's the poetry, which clearly, I mean, scholars know this, but it has not been reflected very much in the translations. The poetry reflects a more archaic stratum of ancient Hebrew. And it uses words that I think you have to call poetic diction. One needs to do something to convey that in English, in my opinion. Okay, I'll give you a tiny example. The flood story in Genesis is inaugurated by a one-line poem. And the one-line poem begins like this. Then, in my translation, then were the casements of the heavens open, and all the springs of the great deep burst forth. Now, why casements? Because the Hebrew word used there, arubot, is a word, I think with one exception. It means window. Rashi in the Middle Ages understood this and said that in the language of the foreign people, meaning French, it is fenestra. So it was understood that it meant window. It also could be just an aperture, a dovecote. But it's not the normal Hebrew word for window. The normal biblical word, as in modern Hebrew, is chalon. So this is poetic diction. And in fact, the cognate of this appears several centuries before the Bible in Ugaritic poetry, which is a cognate Semitic language. So I decided, well, casements is not the normal way you would refer to a window. It's a word that Keats uses in one of the odes. It's a word that Shakespeare uses. So I will go with that, even if a few readers have to look it up. Okay, so there's diction. Then there is, to go back to this issue of conventionally limited vocabulary in the prose narratives. What you would say, well, that's a big disadvantage to a writer. He's not using all the words in the language that he can. But of course, what writers always do is to make an artistic occasion out of limitation, as you do in writing a sonnet. So, words are repeated, but they're repeated playing against different meanings of the same word. And I'll give you one microscopic example. In the story, The Binding of Isaac, in Genesis 22, we have the following verse. And Abraham said to his lads, Hebrew Na'arim, let me and the lad go up and worship, and after we will return to you. Now, most people would say it's crazy to translate, but in both cases it's the word na'ar. It's crazy and confusing to translate na'ar in both cases as lad, because in one instance he's talking to his servants, probably his slaves, and in the other to his son. But I think that's exactly the poignant use that the repetition generates. That is, first Abraham is speaking to slaves, and Abraham said to his lads/slaves, "Let me and the lad," and now the lad is his only son, and it's a word of affection, as David uses it when he says, "Deal gently with the lad Absalom." So I think that unless it's absurd, some people may think it's absurd in this instance, that the artful use of repeated terms should be honored. Then we have the matter of rhythm. Now, it's self-evident in poetry that rhythm is terrifically important. And this is a terrible quandary for the English translator, for linguistic reasons which I won't go into unless somebody wants me to explain this afterwards. Biblical Hebrew is much more compact than modern English. So the two halves of a line of biblical poetry will have only three, typically, this is a schematic of course, 3 accents in each half of the line, and maybe a total of 6 syllables in each half of the line. And that's very hard to do in English. I've worked at various strategies to try to tamp down the expansiveness of the English language, but it doesn't always play out. But poetry is one thing. Rhythm is crucial to the prose as well. And Hebrew narrative prose is beautifully rhythmic. Imagine something like this. Here's an illustration of when I say that something's wrong with the existing translation. Imagine a diabolical editor gets his hands on a manuscript of Moby Dick, and he says, this is a pretty good book, but I can fix it up a little bit. I'll dress up the language. So where Melville writes face, the editor changes this to visage or to countenance. And he does this through the whole manuscript. What would you have at the end of that process? You would have a book which is still a pretty interesting book about a maniacal sea captain who was in pursuit of a great white whale. But the magic of Melville's prose, those wonderful cadences that so often sound Shakespearean and sometimes, in fact, scan as iambic lines, that would vanish. And a lot of the power of Moby Dick would vanish. Well, it's my contention that that's exactly what the modern translators of the Hebrew Bible have done. They've killed the rhythm. The rhythm is the beating heart of the prose, and when the heart stops beating, the prose stops living. The King James people did better. They had a better ear for English. For example, the first chapter of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, is there are a lot of things that I would quarrel with, but they do get a good deal of the mesmerizing rhythm of the prose poetry at the beginning of that book. On the whole, I think the King James people don't do so well with poetry. This may sound surprising. I mean, we all remember the 23rd Psalm and how beautiful it sounds in the King James Version. It is, I have to say, a beauty somewhat different from the Hebrew. That is, where a line in Psalm 23 in the Hebrew might have 8 words and, no, not 8 words, 4 words and 8 syllables, you would find 20 syllables and 11 words in the King James Version. So that makes it poetry that's a little bit more like Walt Whitman who read the King James Version than it does like the ancient Hebrew poetry. But there are also many lines in the King James rendering of ancient Hebrew poetry that are clunky. I think they weren't always listening to the sound. They may have, at least many of those committee members may have been deciphering the text as a written text, but not hearing it. And there are lines that fall all over themselves with an excess of syllables. Okay, now just one illustration of the importance of rhythm. When I started translating Genesis, I really didn't know exactly what I was doing. It's fun to begin a big project not knowing what you're doing. And I got to this line about the creation of the heavenly luminaries. And what I came up with was God created, that's preceded, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. And then I stopped myself short. I said, why did I do that? I mean, why did I say dominion? Almost all the translations say to rule over. The Hebrew uses a kind of gerund, but the Hebrew sounds like this. Et ha'ma'or ha'gadol le'memshelet hayom, v'et ha'ma'or ha'katon le'memshelet halayla, v'et ha'kochavim. Now, in the hands of the priestly writer who's responsible for this, it is just a beautiful cadence which expresses the sense of the harmony of the completion of this aspect of creation. And I realized that cadence was terrifically important for me as a reader of the Hebrew. And that what I had done without intending to do it, because it was unconsciously important to me, was to more or less reproduce the Hebrew cadence in the English. That is, the Memshelet Hayom comes out as for dominion of day, and so forth. So I end up doing a lot of that, sometimes surprising myself. Then there's the matter of expressive syntax. That is, there are variations in the Hebrew syntax, and they're often to a point. Again, I'll give you one small illustration. When Jacob's sons come back from their first journey to Egypt, they give Papa the good news that their his son Simeon has been held hostage in Egypt, and that the man who rules Egypt won't talk to them unless they bring down Benjamin. He says, in my translation, me you have bereaved. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and Benjamin would you take? On me is all the burden. It's almost a poem. It doesn't quite scan, but it's close to verse. Now, so what I want to focus on is the beginning. Me you have bereaved. Now the Hebrew says, Oti shikaltem. That is, Oti means me, and then you have a verb, you bereaved. Well, that's not the normal way to do it in biblical Hebrew. The normal way to do it is to put an accusative suffix at the end of the verb. You would say, you take that verb, the shakel, and you turn it into shikaltuni, meaning you have bereaved me. But the writer decided not to do that. He decided to take me, oti, and put it up front at the beginning of Jacob's speech. And I think, this is my own take on Jacob, that he did it for purposes of characterization. That is, Jacob, from the moment he thinks that Joseph has been devoured by a wild beast, becomes a kind of prima donna of paternal grief. And so at the beginning, he puts himself at the beginning, me you have bereaved. And then at the end he says, on me is all the burden, alai hayu kulana. So I think that one gets a little more of a sense of the liveliness and the psychological conviction of the original by following the syntactic inversion. Now, some people say, well, we don't speak English like that. You wouldn't find a sentence like that in the New York Times or the LA Times. Well, that's true. But I don't think that a translation of the Bible has to read like the daily newspaper. I mean, we still, I say we a little hesitantly, I know that there's a big range of ages in this room, but we still read older poetry, and you don't have to go back very far, certainly not farther than the 19th century, to come across lots of poetic inversion. And this is a kind of poetic text, so why not do it? Okay. Now, let's see. Okay, two more things having to do with the precision and boldness of word choice in the Hebrew Bible, which again I don't think has been sufficiently respected by the existing translations. First, well, I'm going to, I want to leave myself abundant time for longer examples, so I'll just give you one example, a couple of examples of word choice and trying to get it right about word choice. Now, doing biblical philology, and surely the same thing is true for doing classical Greek philology, is a kind of teasing, at moments exasperating, very challenging detective game. That is, you want to find out not just what the broad lexical value of a word is, but its nuance, its connotations, its linguistic register. And of course, I gave an example with the Arubot casements for linguistic register. And you have to use a lot of different tools, and sometimes you're going to be wrong. So, two examples. In the story of the rape of Tamar by her half-brother Amnon, for those of you who are not that familiar with the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of R-rated stuff. X-rated. So for those of you who don't remember this story, I'll just fill you in on the context for a moment. Amnon is dying to have sex with his beautiful half-sister. So a buddy of his advises him to pretend to be sick. And he pretends to be sick and sends a message to his father, who is also Tamar's father, King David, that Tamar has to come to him and prepare for him a particular food item. We don't know really what it is, except it appears to pun on the Hebrew word for heart, H-E-A-R-T. But in this story, a noun and a cognate verb are used maybe half a dozen times, and they very rarely appear in the whole Hebrew Bible outside this story. The noun is biryah, and it refers to food, and the verb is lahavrot, which means to give somebody biryah. Okay? So all the translations I looked at translated as food. I thought this couldn't be right because there are a couple of perfectly good standard terms for food. Ochel, and then the word for bread, lechem, which by synecdoche is also used for food. So why did the writer, multiple times in this story, use this particular word? Okay, one of my most useful tools in figuring out what biblical Hebrew means is a concordance. So I looked at all the occurrences of Birya Lahavrot. In every instance, it's food that you give to somebody who has either been fasting or has been ill and is doing poorly. You could say it's sort of ancient Near Eastern chicken soup, except the chicken wasn't domesticated. So what are you going to do about that? So I puzzled for a while, and then I translated it as nourishment, which has some of that connotation of food that you give to somebody who needs sustaining. Okay, one other instance, I don't know why, but as far as I can tell, that this has not been noticed by biblical scholars. In Hebrew, you have this grammatical formation that's called the construct state. That is, you put two nouns together. Let's say the noun Bayit, which is house, and the noun David, which is David. Okay, that's a proper noun. Let that serve. And with nothing in between them, and out comes Beit David, which means house of David. Right? Now, there's a peculiar variation of this pattern where two nouns are put together, but by now I've collected I know there are a couple of biblical scholars in the room. I've collected maybe 30 or so examples, so it begins to be persuasive. We have two nouns that are synonyms. For example, in Exodus, in the story of, in the 9th plague, the plague of darkness, we have choshech hafelah, which would literally mean darkness of darkness. That is, each of those two nouns means dark. And what I've inferred by looking at all these examples is that when you have two synonyms put together in the construct state with nothing intervening between, it's an intensifier. That is, this choshech hafelah is, I think I translated the utmost darkness. It's kind of hyper darkness. Or another example where, by the way, I think all the translations make an error here in construing the Hebrew. Later in Exodus, when God says, look, I reveal myself to you in, and then he says, Ba'av Anan. Now, Anan means cloud. Most translations render this as a thick cloud, which is wrong, because the translations confuse Av, which also means cloud, with Aveh, which has another consonant at the end of it, which means thick. So it isn't thick, it's the cloud, the welkin cloud, or the thunderhead cloud. I think I translated it as the utmost cloud, because there's something mythical about this cloud. You see, if you look at those philological precisions, then the text begins to have a nuance and liveliness it might not otherwise have. Okay, one last point about word choices. I think that the biblical writers sometimes make daring choices, and the translators don't have the courage to go along with their daringness. The story of Hagar banished to the wilderness with her son Ishmael. You remember the water skin is drained of all its water, and they're in the hot desert, and she's persuaded that her only son is on the point of death. So she, and I'm going to say the verb in Hebrew, vatashlichenu, under one of the bushes. Now, some translations say she placed him under one of the bushes. Others say she put him under one of the bushes. The King James Version is a little better. It says she thrust him under one of the bushes. But that verb in biblical Hebrew means one thing only. It means to fling. It's the very verb that Pharaoh uses when he says, every male born to the Hebrews you shall fling into the Nile. They're not putting him in the Nile, they're flinging him into the Nile. So I translated it as she flung him under one of the bushes. And what is going on there? I think the writer understood that this woman was on the brink of utter despair. Her only son was about to die. And in a kind of paroxysm of maternal grief, she flings him under one of the bushes and then runs off to a great distance so she won't have to watch while he dies. So the choice of a single word can make a great difference. Okay, one last thing before I move on to my longer examples. Biblical Hebrew is very concrete. And my conviction is that the power, the literary power, and maybe even in certain ways the theological or conceptual power of these texts is best conveyed by sticking to the concreteness of the Hebrew. And I'll give just one example from Kohelet, otherwise known as Ecclesiastes. It's the recurring phrase, Hevel. Now, we know from all over the Bible that Hevel has to do with something that has no substance. So it's the King James people translated as vanity, of course with the Latin sense of vanitas in mind, that is something that's futile. Some modern translators translate as futility and so forth. The problem with all those translations is that they transpose the Hebrew into an abstraction, whereas the Hebrew is strong precisely because it's concrete. That is, the primary meaning of Hevel is breath. Something that comes out of the mouth you can't see and it's gone. So, breath didn't quite work, so I translated it as mere breath. And that opened the possibility that mere breath could represent futility, absurdity, as one scholar argues, for vanity, emptiness, and so forth. And the phrase with which it's paired in Kohelet is rendered by the King James Version as vexation of spirit. Both those words are wrong. It's not spirit, it's wind. The same word can mean one or the other. And that doesn't mean vexation. I think that they thought it was related to a root that meant evil, but it doesn't. It comes from a root that means to shepherd sheep. So what is the expression? It's, in my version, herding the wind, which is even more extreme than herding cats. That is, what could be more futile than trying to herd the wind? So the strength of the Hebrew comes through its concreteness. Okay, I now will take a few minutes for a couple of extended examples. I don't want to try your patience for too long, so I'll skip a couple that I had in mind. Okay, the first has to do with dialogue. Genesis 20. And Abraham journeyed onward from there to the Negev region, and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, take in biblical Hebrew often means to marry. So took here clearly implies he took her into his harem. And God came to Abimelech in a night dream and said to him, you were a dead man because of the woman you took, and she is another's wife. He was terrifically abrupt. Hincha met. You're a dead man, or you're dead. And I think that God's abruptness needs to get into the dialogue. You see what I mean about the dialogue gesturing in the direction of the colloquial. But Abimelech had not come near her. He hadn't had sex with her. And he said, my Lord, will you slay a nation even if innocent? Now, that sounds very strange. Will you slay a nation even if innocent? But the Hebrew sounds very strange. Hagoy gam tzadik taharog. I think that the weirdness of the formulation of the Hebrew is because it's referring back to the previous episode, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. That is, there Abraham had this bargaining session with God. Will you destroy the city if there are 50 righteous men? And so forth. So it's almost as though Abimelech is saying, now you have your old tricks, destroying nations when there are righteous people in them. Okay, I'm going to skip to the exchange the next morning, which you can imagine is not an easy exchange between Abimelech and Abraham. And Abimelech called to Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have I offended you that you should bring upon me and my kingdom so great an offense? Things that should not be done you have done to me. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you imagine when you did this thing? I can't resist a very brief comment that does not have to do with translation. There's a set way to present dialogue in biblical narrative, which is an X said to Y, blah, 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 and Y answered and said, blah, blah, blah. But in many instances, and here I've collected maybe 50 or 60 examples, you have something different. You have an X said to Y, and then X's speech, and then an X said to Y, and X continues talking. Why the repetition of the inquit form, the formula for introducing speech? In every instance that I've been able to identify, it's because the interlocutor has a problem about responding. Either he's abashed or embarrassed or dumbfounded or just utterly surprised. And so this is the signal we get by the repetition of an X said to Y. And Abraham said, so finally Abraham has figured out his response. For I thought there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And in point of fact, she is my sister, my father's daughter, though not my mother's daughter, and she became my wife. Now, I know we have professors of law here. This sounds to me like legal hair splitting. What it really refers to has been debated by scholars for generations. But he uses this phrase, this word "omna," which sounds to me like a term of argument or a legal term. He's been backed into a corner, and now he comes up with an explanation. And it happened, I'm going to read just one more sentence here, when the gods made me a wanderer from my father's house, that I told her, this is the kindness you can do to me in every place to which we come, save me, is my brother. Okay, the small thing, which to me is a tiny symptom of the extraordinary liveliness of biblical dialogue, which I've become convinced over the years is the true precursor of novelistic dialogue. In Homer you have wonderful speeches, but not this kind of give and take and characterizing speech. You have long discourses, which is different. So he says that when the gods made me a wanderer, I think that I'm the only translator of this chapter who translates Elohim as the gods. But I'm dead positive that I'm right. Why? Because Elohim, some of you may know, it's a linguistic anomaly. It has a plural suffix, im, masculine plural, but it refers to the God of Israel, and it's treated grammatically as a singular. Usually it's treated grammatically as a singular. And then there are various scholarly theories why it preserves the plural suffix. So, I think that when it's treated grammatically as a plural, it doesn't refer to God, it refers to the gods. And it has a plural verb here. Vayihi kasher hituni Elohim. A plural conjugation of the verb to make into a wanderer. Why does he say the gods? He says the gods because he's speaking to a polytheist. And he doesn't want to confuse him, and it's a kind of manner of speaking. As fate would have it, I became a wanderer. The gods made me a wanderer. So you might say that the social, cultural dimension of the exchange between Abraham and Abimelech comes through beautifully just by making God into the gods and conjugating the verb attached to it in the plural. I'm going to, maybe I will suffice with two more extended examples, which are quite different. The beginning, this is 2 Samuel chapter 12. It's the parable of the poor man's ewe, that is E-W-E. The context is, and those of you who are going to be at the seminar will be discussing the whole surround to this, but now I'm focusing on translation. The prophet Nathan has heard, who hasn't appeared before in the narrative, has heard about David's murder by proxy of Bathsheba's husband Uriah. And he comes to him and he begins his, it will turn into a curse on David's head, but it begins with a parable. And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. The rich man had sheep and cattle in great abundance, and the poor man had nothing save one little ewe that he had bought. And he nurtured her and raised her with him, together with his sons. From his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie. And she was to him like a daughter. And a wayfarer came to the rich man, and it seemed a pity to him to take from his own sheep and cattle to prepare for the traveler who had come to him. And he took the poor man's ewe and prepared it for the man who had come to him. And then David, of course, bursts out in anger and pronounces a legal sentence on this man, at which point, very famously, Nathan says, "You are the man." Right? It's really like the play within the play in Hamlet, where the play is the thing wherein I have the conscience of the king. So, the language and the rhythm of the parable set it off very markedly in the Hebrew from the surrounding narrative. There is one thing that I couldn't really do anything with, which is that there are at least 3 items of vocabulary that don't appear elsewhere and mark the difference. That is the word for poor man, the word for wayfarer, and one or two others. I couldn't figure out how to do that in English, and sometimes you just have to throw up your hands in despair. But there's something else. There is a sing-song rhythm to the parable, which marks it as a parable. And of course, David does not pick this up at all. That is, in the beginning, if I remember, begins Shnei Anashim Hayu Be'ir Echad Echad Ashir V'Echad Rash, which I represented as 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. And let me tell you, sometimes when you work on a translation, you come up with something that for you is a secret triumph, even though you know in full lucidity that nobody will ever notice. So I'm going to give you that example here. From his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie, which is, I hope I remember correctly in the Hebrew, mipito tochal umikoso tishteh uv'cheko tishkav. The Hebrew is a little bit more compact than my translation, but not too much. I think I get it using only monosyllabic words. And I was very happy when I thought that a nice English equivalent for pot, a piece of bread, is crust, and it kept it down to 1 syllable and preserved the rhythm. Okay, now I probably shouldn't try your patience too much longer, so let me just do the following. Okay, I want to go back to the flood story. And read a little stretch here of about 11 verses. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came, water over the earth. Which is exactly what the Hebrew says, Mayim al Pnei Ha'adamah. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives came into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of the clean animals and the animals that were not clean, and of the fowl, and of all that crawls upon the ground, 2 each came to Noah into the ark, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And it happened after 7 days that the waters of the flood were over the earth. Now, I want to stop here for a moment. By the way, the King James is on the whole pretty good on this. All the modern versions are translated. The writer doesn't say the waters surged over the earth, the waters overwhelmed the earth, the waters rose up over it. It said the waters were over the earth. And using that bare bones simplicity of a primary term, I think has an eloquence of its own, an eloquence characteristic of biblical narrative. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, and here's our line of poetry that I referred to before, all the I reversed the order when I quoted by heart. All the well springs of the great deep burst, and the casements of the heavens were open. And the rain was over the earth 40 days and 40 nights. That very day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons together with them, came into the ark, they as well as beasts of each kind, and cattle of each kind, and each kind of crawling thing that crawls on the earth, and each kind of bird, each winged thing. Of course, here there's a reminiscence of the creation of the Lord in this catalog. They came to Noah into the ark, 2 by 2 of all flesh that has the breath of life within it. And those that came in, male and female of all flesh, they came as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. And the flood was 40 days over the earth. Again, was, as in the previous example. And the waters multiplied. Now, it sounds a little strange in English to say that waters multiplied. I mean, kids in an arithmetic class multiply, but I think the strangeness may pay off, because there is a deliberate echo of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And here it's a reversal of that process, where the waters are multiplying and emptying earth of living creatures. The waters multiplied, and the bore the ark upward, and it rose above the earth. And the waters surged and multiplied mightily over the earth. And the ark went on the surface of the water. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Again, what is complementary to what I was saying about the use of the verb was, is the verb went. There are other ways in biblical Hebrew which the prose writers tend to avoid, to talk about a ship sailing or floating. And if you look at the sundry modern English versions of the Bible, you find that they all punch in a nautical term here, because it seems to them not right to say the ark went on the surface of the water. But for me, as a reader anyway, part of the beauty is precisely reproducing the simplicity of the Hebrew. Now, I could do all kinds of other things. I really haven't done anything with biblical poetry and how you handle that. But I don't want this to go on. It's getting late in the evening. So let me just say this by way of the conclusion. My purpose in reading to you these samples of what I've done with these biblical texts is not, it may sound that way, but it's not really to pat myself on the back. Any honest translator of a great text knows that there are all kinds of things that he or she has not really been able to achieve in the translation of that text, simply because you haven't figured out a solution, and maybe somebody with a more brilliant sense of the expressive possibilities of English could come up with such a solution, or in some instances, and I open myself up to this, you made a bad call. That is, you decided on something because you thought you were achieving an important effect, but in fact, there might be a blunder in what you thought you were achieving. So it's there, warts and all, but I think at least what I would like to have conveyed this evening is that there are subtleties and strengths and complexities in the Hebrew style of both the poems and the prose narratives that translators really have not tried to grapple with, because they don't think of the Bible in those terms. And for better or for worse, I'm trying to grapple with it. Thank you. the acoustics in here seems to be pretty good. So I'd be happy to entertain a few questions. I would encourage anybody who asks, my hearing ain't what she used to be, I would encourage you to speak up loud and clear. Yes?
What kind of attention do you give to continuity of translation throughout the Bible? And how much of that is influenced by context? And just as a, say, random example, the Hebrew word for fall, right? Sometimes it's rendered, and when someone falls on their face, as prostrates or bows. And how would you suggest Rebecca got off her camel?
I think it's a strange use of the verb that usually means to fall, but I don't think she toppled off. So I think, I don't even remember, a sign of that I've remained honest is that I remember the Hebrew text much better than I do my translation. So I don't remember exactly, I might have said elided as probably the King James did. Now, there are, of course, other words besides nafal, fall, that mean to make contact with the ground. Right? There is a verb that means to bow down, a verb that means to kneel, and so forth. So you're not necessarily seeing variation in translations when suddenly someone is prostrate instead of falling. But here's my policy. Wherever possible, I try to maintain the same English equivalent for the Hebrew word, but sometimes it's not possible. I don't want to, in order to preserve continuity, as you will, I don't want to commit absurdities. So, for example, at the beginning of Genesis, we have a very ordinary Hebrew word, Adamah, which clearly means soil. That is, God, in the second version of creation, shapes, the way a potter does, shapes the first human with soil that he's taken. The problem is that, and sometimes it appears in agricultural context, workers of the soil. The problem is that Adamah also means land. And in a context where it clearly means land, you'd be misleading readers to translate it as soil. And occasionally it even means the earth. And if the context is absolutely compelling, then you have to knuckle under. But mostly I try to preserve continuity, especially if I see that some thematic point is being made. Okay, here's an example. A word that many people in this room will know, bracha, means blessing, right? It also, in some contexts, means gift. Now, when Jacob is reunited with Esau after their 20 years of separation, he brings these flocks, that was the currency, and he says, take, pray, this gift. But he doesn't say gift. He says blessing. He says bracha. And clearly that resonates against the stealing of the blessing. And when the outraged Esau says to his father Isaac in a dialogue that Jacob could not have heard, and he actually took the blessing. So there's a kind of restitution in take the blessing. And never, even though blessing is a little weird there, I decided you have to keep it.
that's great.
So you attribute part of the problem to lack of literary training in the people aren't educated classically, they're not reading enough text. But so that would be one reason. Writing by committee might be another reason. Are there functional reasons in terms of what various religious bodies are trying to convey, or other reasons that have occurred to you?
Well, by and large, I think the recent translations by ecclesiastical scholarly groups have avoided or tried to avoid theological tendentiousness. There's a lot of that in the King James Version, which is one of the problems with it. The Jewish Publication Society often goes, or sometimes goes in the other direction. It tries to correct the theological tendentiousness of the Christian translation. It seems to be legitimate. But I think that there may be another reason. While the King James people were very scholarly, they were not professorial. The professorate hadn't quite established itself the way it has in great institutions like UCLA and other campuses. So the professorial stance carries with it a certain impulse to explain things. That's what professors do, right? The explanations get into the translation. So that for example, this goes back to your very good question. The general strategy of the 20th century translators of the Bible has been to translate terms by context. So obviously they would never translate bracha as blessing if it means gift. And they try to discriminate all the different meanings of the same term. And each time the term pops up, you will find a different English equivalent because it's a different context. Now, occasionally you have to do this, but on the whole I think it's a mistake, and it's a mistake for literary reasons. Yes?
I'm going to try to ask a somewhat complex question to get you to comment on two things at once. So I'm a big fan of the Robert Crumb Genesis thing. I am. I'm a big fan of it. I'm an admirer of it. And so I'm trying to sort of find out how involved you were in that.
That's an easy one.
Okay, and I'm going to ask a specific question that's actually important, somewhat, at least, especially somewhat from a Christian perspective, and probably not only from a Christian perspective. There are those who think that Isaac was in his 30s at the time of the binding of Isaac.
Yeah, the Midrash thinks that.
Okay, so the explanation you gave tonight explains that well. Lad, servant, lad, Isaac, could be in his 30s.
He could be, right, because Absalom is called lad. Right.
So now, Crumb, very emotionally, it's a young, innocent boy. So did you even tell him, it doesn't have to be that. It could be a guy in his 30s. I mean...
No, I don't know how many of you have seen the Robert Crumb Genesis. It is a verse-by-verse comic book illustration of the book of Genesis. And Robert Crumb, and not met face-to-face, lives somewhere in rural France, I gather in a ménage à trois. And he's a very peculiar man. There's a film documentary on him.
There is.
See how peculiar he is. But talented, quite
very talented. So
he wrote me, sending me a sample of a few pages, and asked if he could have permission to use my translation, but use it according to his lights, mixing it with the King James Version, at least from time to time. So I said yes, and we came to an amicable agreement. He paid me a modest amount. We had the same publisher, W.W. Norton. When the book came out, I was a little put off by what he did with my translation because he didn't always quote it. He sometimes emended it. And I was not thrilled with that. Okay. I take no position on Isaac's age because I don't think that the biblical narrative is very consistent about this kind of chronology. But I will say a couple of sentences about the Crumb version. Some of it is brilliantly imaginative, and I love his Tower of Babel, where everybody's wandering around, and then there are speech bubbles. And in one speech bubble, there are Hebrew words, and in another speech bubble, cuneiform, and in the third hieroglyphics. That's pretty good, I think. And some of it is very vivid and very powerful. I think he doesn't do that well with the mysterious aspects of Genesis. Like Jacob wrestling with a mysterious stranger, angel, whatever he is. It looks like two middle-aged guys who are kind of paunchy having it out. And now the other thing, which is simply built into the medium, is that a visual image is univocal and determinative. It's one thing and not another thing. So when we're told that in Noah's generation the sons of man had done evil, you have 3 or 4 illustrations of the evil that they're doing, but that sort of closes down possibility. So it's a fascinating and enjoyable book, but it also has limitations. Yes?
I'm wondering specifically about how you do verbless clauses. I've heard you do them both in prose and in poetry, and in poetry in English, it makes a lot of sense, or at least it's a little more natural to render them without verbs, as you do, for instance, in the first song, Happy the Man.
Yeah, right.
But I heard you tonight even mention one where Mayim Alpine right, in Genesis, and you said water over the earth.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how do you approach verbless clauses, and when do you determine that, for instance, at that point in Genesis, that it's useful in prose even to render them verbless? Because I think in English, we would say it's prose, you gotta have a verb. And I'm just wondering how you approach the prose ones.
Okay, I want to back up for a moment before I directly answer your question. I believe, for various reasons that might be a little technical to go into here, that the narrative prose of the Bible was already a stylized language. That is, it wasn't altogether the language that people were speaking on the farms of the kingdom of Judah and Israel, or in the streets of Jerusalem. One way you can tell that is the extreme limitation of vocabulary. I don't think people could have gotten along on that kind of limited vocabulary in their everyday transactions. So I think that conveying the biblical prose in an English that feels sometimes like literary stylization is okay, as long as it's not totally awkward or unintelligible. So since I hear a certain starkness in Mayim al Panei Haaretz, I like the verbless English rendering of it. Okay? Okay, maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
I'm curious, and if this is an unfair question, ignore it.
Okay.
But it's been a few years since your big 5 Books of Moses translation, and I'm wondering, because I get the sense that you go over this repeatedly and you're constantly engaged. Are there things that you look back on now, and you allude to this at the end of your talk, where you think, oh, I didn't quite get that right, or I wish I would have maybe done this a little bit differently? Are there things where you look back at?
No, that's a fair question. A few things, but it's kind of minor tuning up rather than extensive translations, transformations. I mean, occasionally, I've maybe come across a couple of those, but I translated something and then I decided later that it was a mistake. That is a mistake in construing the Hebrew. That I did this with an item of apparel that appears in a battle scene in 2 Samuel, which everybody translates as garment or tunic or belt. And so I thought, okay, I'll translate it as tunic. But then when I went over Samuel years later, a couple of years ago, I realized it had to mean armor. And there are both philological reasons why that word means armor, and also a contextual reason, because we know from Homer, when you kill an enemy warrior, you don't take his tunic, you take his armor. So there are a few things, but not very many, and just occasionally say a word or phrase that's recurred a lot, and I translate it in one way, and then also it hits me that there's a slightly more felicitous way. So I'm doing a little fine tuning. Okay, maybe these 2 last yeah. Up here and then in the back.
So, did you translate the entire Bible, like even the Song of Songs too, or the?
As we say, inshallah. Okay, what I've done is the translations that I've published are a little less than 2/3 of the Bible, and I'm including a small volume that will come out in March, which begins with the Song of Songs. It's 5 late biblical books. I'm now working on the prophets, so if you add together what's been published with what I have in draft, it's about 3/4, and I don't expect to live forever, but I think it's now realistic that before too long I can do the whole book. Oh, wow.
So there's a verse that King Solomon says, I built, the bathhouses and palaces, and I have had everything.
Yeah, that's in Kohelet.
And I've even had Shedim and Shedot. The Talmud explains it as like demons, and in the Hebrew translation it's translated as, I don't remember what it's translated as. So did you translate it according to the Talmud or
No.
the Hebrew?
No, I think that the Talmud kind of merged the word that it's Shedim to Shedot, which is different from Shedim and Shedot. In the okay, let me confess one of the dirty secrets of scholars of the Bible, that there are many words, I don't know, probably, Bill, you might know how many that are called Habakkuk's Legomena, which they appear only once in the Bible. There's certainly hundreds of them.
1400.
How many?
1400.
Thank you. You see, I'm bringing the right people into this one. Okay, so in those 1400 cases, sometimes you can get lucky and you find an Akkadian word or a Ugaritic word that, you know, bullseye fits the context and say, that's a loan word and it means whatever, Rumpelstiltskin. In many cases, you're not so lucky, and you have to rely on context. For example, there are a lot of these one-time only words that appear in poetry, and if we don't know what they are, because the two halves of the line are usually semantically parallel. So you say, well, if that, for example, mesquite in Isaiah, it appears in a half line that parallels one that refers to ship. So you say some kind of ship. So the Shidim Shidot in Kohelet, it looks like they are young women who give one pleasure, maybe not sexual pleasure, but through singing or performance. It's part of the palatial luxury of Kohelet's first-person narrative. So that seems much more likely than ghosts. Okay, just one last one.
According to biblical scholars, this way of speaking that we do, like, I have this gut feeling, or like, she stole my heart, wherein we use anatomical organs, for example, to represent certain concepts.
Yeah.
Heart for love and whatnot. Goes all the way back to like the Hebrew tradition. What is the kind of logic behind, like, when you do this interpretation? Do you know if there's a kind of like, what's in the heart that it should represent kind of love, or, you know, those way of speaking where they're supposed to use like gut or heart or something like that?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, okay, that's actually fairly easy to explain. And I'm going to give another example where you can't quite go with the original, as much as I always try to go to the original. As I said before, biblical Hebrew is quite poor in abstractions. It's not an accident that formal philosophy never emerged in ancient Israel. The closest thing I think really is Kohelet, is Ecclesiastes. But even he uses concrete terms for abstractions. So they had this physiological system in which different inner organs, they said they had no word for intellect. They had no word for what we call mind or brain. So the word for heart, that they assumed, and I don't know enough about pre-biblical culture to know where this might have come from, but they assumed that the heart was the seat of understanding, the kidneys were the seat of conscience, and the bowels were the seat of compassion. Okay. So heart can work pretty well. So I almost always use heart for Hebrew lev or levav. Very occasionally, if the context involves a lot of intellection, I might say, like for the lo ya'aleh, literally will not go up on the heart, I say it will not come to mind, because heart sounds a little strange there. But the bowels is a tricky one. The King James Version translated it almost always as bowels. which for us, of course, is just associated with a lower body function, and certainly not with compassion. As a result, for a couple of centuries, because the King James was very influential, bowels came to mean compassion in English, or sometimes used to mean compassion. And in fact, here's a famous misconstruction. Somewhere there, Jonathan Swift says, I hate the very word vowels. Now, Norman O'Brown, the psychoanalytic theorist, said, this demonstrates that she had a problem with anal retention and this and that. But of course, what he was inveighing against was sentimentality.
Very good.
So one has to find, in that case, I also don't turn it into an abstraction. I'm not sure if I may not use the same solution always, but something like, actually sometimes I translate it as heart, because we do associate heart with compassion, but again I judge by context. Well, thank you very much.